both in person and our Zoom audience as well. Today, we'll have a discussion on the destruction of healthcare systems in Gaza, realities and ramifications of a genocide, and actions that people can take at this time. I'd like to begin with a gratitude to Community Church of Boston for providing this space to us. And I'd like to mention all of our sponsors: Community Church of Boston, Massachusetts Peace Action, Alliance for Water Justice in Palestine, Peace and Common Security Working Group of Watertown Citizens, JVP Boston, Doctors Against Genocide, Arlington for Palestine, and Southeastern Massachusetts Coalition for a Free Palestine. So you can see we have broad community support. At this time, I'd like to mention that everyone, regardless of where they are, has access to speaker bios and today's agenda. Having said that, we'll do a brief introduction. Before I get to that, sorry, I would like to introduce the event planning team. It was a huge effort. So Annie, yeah, and Becky, Marette, Julie, Richard, and downstairs yet is Anne. Yes. Okay, so our speakers. First up, we'll have Dr. Thaer Ahmad. He's an emergency physician. He worked in Gaza in 2024 at Nasser and Al-Aqsa hospitals. He'll be followed by Dr. Bram Wispelwey, Harvard Chan School of Public Health, co-founder of Health for Palestine, recently having returned from the West Bank, and Dr. Othman Mohammad, child and adolescent psychiatrist, Gaza mental health expert, and Diaspora Palestinian. So with that, I'd like to invite Dr. Thaer Ahmad to the podium.
All right. Thank you all very much. Really appreciate the opportunity to be here with all of you. I want to first say that it's the first day of Ramadan, so I am fasting, so I apologize for any sort of brain fog that I may be exhibiting. Usually takes a couple of days to get used to it. The second thing is, and I hope, can we go to is it possible to go to like a speaker mode or presentation mode, if possible? And we can kind of move through these slides. The second thing I want to mention is a ceasefire is supposed to expire in the next few hours, actually. And so I think this discussion is particularly relevant. I think it's important to discuss sort of what were some of the things that have been done, what does the situation look like on the ground, and sort of a pattern of behavior that we noticed over the course of 16 months, certainly not established in the last 16 months, but a system that was designed to attack life in Gaza 360 degrees. And obviously, I will probably talk about it from the perspective of the healthcare infrastructure that's on the ground. But this, of course, could extend to the educational infrastructure, so on and so forth. It just, you know, there was a deliberate and intentional effort to destroy the Gaza Strip, but to destroy life in itself. So whether that's water infrastructure, whether that's schools, whether that's UNRWA, whether that's the hospital system, those are the efforts that were being made. And I think if there's any point that I really want to emphasize, it's that we have Palestinian healthcare workers and experts on the ground in Gaza, and there's also been an effort to diminish their voices, to undermine their institutions. And so any opportunity to make sure that we are listening to what they have to say, that we are relaying what they are communicating to us, and that we are insisting that they lead the effort in any sort of response or recovery, I think is your best chance of success. Otherwise, we're going to be looking at a disaster. The first thing I want to take you through is the EMT process, the emergency medical team process that was established by the World Health Organization to get into Gaza. And so we know after October 7th, the borders were sealed shut. And maybe I can. Is it? Huh? Okay, perfect. So, obviously we know that the Gaza Strip after 2006 imposed by the a blockade was imposed by the Israeli authorities. They cited security reasons, but really what we saw take place was that the very few opportunities to access the Gaza Strip suddenly became much more intensely blockaded. A siege was in place. Everything from food to commercial goods to humanitarian aid was inspected very heavily. But when you look at the map here, and I think the next slide, I zoom in into Gaza, if we can go to the next slide. Yeah, if I want you to pay attention to a few specific areas, and I'll point them out. First, there's really only two pedestrian crossings in the Gaza Strip, traditional pedestrian crossings that existed before October 7th. You have Rafah crossing down here, and then you have Beit Hanun or Erez crossing right over here. You see that tiny X. Yeah, there are other accesses to Israel. So there's Kerem Shalom down here. There's Nitzarim up here. There are a couple of other opportunities to access it. But the way people were getting in and out were through those two crossings. The second thing I want you to pay attention to is the density in the Gaza Strip. Now, this is before October 7th, but what we saw after a temporary ceasefire was implemented is we saw similar movements of the populations and the density really returned. So up here, you have 5 different governance of the Gaza Strip. Gaza City is your most densely populated spot in Gaza. That's when they say most densely populated place on earth. They're really referring to Gaza City, and think about it, it's more densely populated than Tokyo. Then you've got these other main areas, Deir al-Balah, Khan Yunis, Rafah, and then you over here in the north, right, this spot right here is where you'll have places like Jabalia, if you're familiar with hearing what was on there. So we saw after a ceasefire agreement, a temporary one was implemented, we saw more than 600 or 700,000 Palestinians return to the north. Yeah, okay. Yes, I'll stay at the mic. Yeah. So we saw more than 600, 700,000 people return to the north, despite the infrastructure being destroyed. Next slide. So again, I want to just point this picture because something that has been stripped away, and again, I think it again undermines this idea of Palestinian healthcare institutions, is there's a traditional corridor that exists. The Gaza Strip, as it was making strides despite a blockade and a siege before October 7th, as it was making strides and providing care, I mean, we're really making big improvements with respect to pediatric cancer care, even cardiac catheterization, like really making some progress. The healthcare workers doing an incredible job. There was still a decent amount of people that needed to be transferred outside of Gaza. In fact, if we look at the numbers over a 3-year period, 2019 to 2021, there were 280,000 people that left the Gaza Strip to get medical care and then came back to the Gaza Strip. Where did the majority of those people go? The majority of those people stayed in Palestine. They went to East Jerusalem and the West Bank, over 50% of them. Over 50% of the people in Gaza, the Palestinians in Gaza, were being treated by Palestinians at hospitals like Al-Maqasid, which is in East Jerusalem, or Ramallah Hospital in the West Bank. After October 7th, this medical evacuation corridor has been totally shut down, deliberately by the Israelis. They don't want patients in Gaza to be able to be treated by Palestinians in other areas. And in fact, what we're seeing as a result of this ceasefire agreement, where you are having 50 cases a day being transferred out through Rafah, and I say 50, I say that very generously because we've seen some days it's 35 cases, some days it's 40 cases, some days it is 50 cases. But since January 20th, those cases are only going through Rafah, which is the Egypt Sinai that you can see there, and they're being stationed in Al Arish port, which is that city right there on the Mediterranean in Egypt. And the Egyptian system, which is already very poor to begin with, their healthcare system, is completely overwhelmed by this influx of cases that are arriving every single day. And so the natural thought or the natural ask in this situation is, why can't we reestablish the corridor that exists? Why can't we reestablish it and allow Palestinians who would be a lot more comfortable leaving Gaza if they were going to stay in Palestine? Why can't we let them go to these hospitals? And that's still something that, as far as advocacy goes, we're trying to work hard on. We've not made a lot of headway. I will say one other thing that's important to know. These cases of Palestinians in Gaza who are leaving for medical evacuation have to sign an informed consent that's given to them by the World Health Organization that says, once you cross the Rafah crossing, we have no control of your ability to be able to return. We cannot guarantee you the right to return, which causes a significant amount of angst, as you can imagine, anxiety, and hesitation. And we are seeing people suddenly refuse the care that they need because they're not going to separate from their families. It's already a miserable process to get a companion permit from the Israelis. Imagine suddenly telling a mother of 6 that this child you're going to get the medical care for, but we're not sure if you'll ever be able to return. And we have thousands of people in Egypt, stranded in Egypt, who would like to return to Gaza, who are not able to return to Gaza, which, again, any sort of plans that you hear about forced expulsion, ethnic cleansing, I mean, these are evoking also generational trauma within people who already have been ethnically cleansed from areas in 1948 during the Nakba. Next slide. Next slide, we can see this is just about the blockade that we mentioned. So this is an important slide because I just got an update recently from the health cluster. This is before October 7th. So the World Health Organization develops a list and it says, hey, we would like each country, based on its demographics and the non-communicable diseases that are there and the communicable diseases that are present, to have these medicines in their central drug storage, in their central drug supply. And so before October 7th, this is from 2022, the West Bank at any given time had 90%. In the Gaza Strip, at any given day, when you went to their central drug storage, they would only have 55% of those drugs available. These are things like anesthetics, they're antibiotics, if there is cholera endemic to the region, which there is no cholera endemic, thank God, to Palestine, but you would require, the anti-parasite or antibiotic that you would need. That's what the WHO recommends. So looking at the numbers right now, when we look at the central drug supply in Gaza, during the ceasefire, during 42 days of a ceasefire agreement, we find that this number is now at 47%. And we see that we have new problems arising. Things like scabies is pretty widespread given the devastation to the water infrastructure. And so as we move forward thinking about what does the next phase of a ceasefire look like, or what does recovery and reconstruction actually look like, we want to make sure that as international NGOs start to mobilize their resources and big UN agencies start to get involved, is that they are staying cognizant of what's required on the ground. I mean, what we have in these scenarios, especially in Gaza, because of the lack of telecommunications and the really difficult ability for people on the ground to move from space to spaces, we weren't getting the data that we wanted. And so what you'll see sometimes, even though there may be good intentions, is you get a mobilization of resources that aren't needed in that moment. You need other resources to be delivered. You need other things to make it inside of Gaza. For example, at Al-Aqsa Hospital, when I was there, we had a huge amount of normal saline for the IV fluids. But we needed other items. We needed medical disposables. Instead, we have a warehouse full of these items, and we don't have some of the antibiotics that we were looking for or some of the creams that we needed to treat certain skin diseases. Next slide. And then this is just a brief look. Again, the notion or the term medical apartheid has existed for a very long time. And so this is what the process looked like for anybody in Gaza that was trying to leave Gaza for medical treatment before October 7th. Now, as we have, seen the effects of genocide and medicide, as we're trying to refer to it, this process has become increasingly more cumbersome and more bureaucratic and very cruel, in fact, because we now have a list of at least 12,000 people in Gaza who need to be evacuated urgently, who need to get out now. If they don't get out, the thought is that they will die waiting on this list. So this whole process where you would um, get financial approval from the Ministry of Health, then you start submitting your documents to the Israeli authorities, and then the Israeli authorities decide if you're worthy of being granted a permit to get medical treatment. Now what we're seeing is that there are less opportunities for patients to actually be able to get out and to get out in a timely fashion. And so, again, this system and the structure that's in place has been there for a very long time. And when you are dropping 2,000-pound bombs and you're destroying hospitals and you're killing doctors and arresting doctors, it gets the system gets stressed to a way that it collapses. And so people unnecessarily die. Next slide. This is just really to illustrate that there's a lot of data that when you have a system like that, people unnecessarily die. The mortality rate gets higher. Even for non-urgent cases, there's a higher mortality rate. Next slide. Again, talking about the borders here. Next slide. I'll say one comment about this as we move to the next couple of slides here. So there has been, as you can imagine, there are profiteers off of war and genocide. That's just sort of the reality on the ground. But something that's particularly concerning when it came to Palestinians who were trying to exit through Egypt is the insane amount of money that was being charged per person. You know, we saw rates fluctuate from $5,000 to $15,000, depending at what stage of the genocide we were in. For a population that more than half of the population lives under the global poverty line, you're talking about life savings being spent to get a non-status in Egypt, just to be able to get away from the Israeli military, to flee an area temporarily. And these people were crossing into Egypt under these visas that wouldn't allow them to have their kids go to school, wouldn't allow them to get primary health services. This is still the case now. There's still what we think is probably 100,000 Palestinians who went out that way. This is, again, a brief talk about the water infrastructure and the food. This is pre-October 7th. So when you destroy the water infrastructure, the Israelis knew very well what they were doing. Next slide. This is just a comparison pre-October 7th of the life expectancy rate comparing Palestine to Israel, as well as infant and child mortality. So, this is why it's important when there is an article that came out, I think about a month and a half ago, that looked at life expectancy in Gaza in 2024, and the age was 43. We're really just trying to illustrate, the devastation and the impact. And this is important when we're dealing with public health and when we're talking about response. You have to understand the scale of what's happening here. And fortunately, for us, and I think probably what was going to obviously makes Israel look very bad, whichever way you turn it, is they are considered a country that has technological advancements, a strong healthcare system. In fact, one of their hospitals yesterday was a part of the top 10 hospitals in the world. And so for their government and their military to inflict this sort of havoc, and then they get to enjoy the right to health, it's a very clear hypocrisy that we're able to at least pinpoint and look at. And then this is on the side here, this is something called like an odds ratio. And the only thing is, if you were in Palestine, again, kilometers away from Israel, if you're in Palestine, in Gaza, or in the West Bank, and you have a heart disease, you're 3 times more likely to die than if you were in Israel. Same thing when it comes to a stroke or Alzheimer's disease. So, the data is really well established here. Next slide. Next slide. This is kind of taking us to present day. So I wanted to bring this up because, I hear a lot about the casualty count, and I think it's important to say 2 things. First, the Ministry of Health in Gaza is very thorough when it comes to the casualty count. And so we know it's an undercount because they insist on having the Palestinian ID number for every single person that has been killed by the Israelis. They insist on issuing a death certificate. So we are getting an undercount. And as the ceasefire extends, and as we hopefully hope the ceasefire doesn't break down, and I hope we can get to a stage 2 and we can get to a permanent ceasefire, you're going to see this number drastically rise. And that's something that every public health expert will tell you. And that's something that when somebody tries to say something, oh, the Ministry of Health, you're taking their numbers. Well, we shouldn't take their numbers. Their numbers are very low right now, but that's how methodical they are about putting together the numbers that are there. If you look at the government media office, they're including the people who are trapped beneath the rubble. But if we're being serious and we're looking at satellite imagery and we're talking about the non-direct causes, so people who died because there was a war inflicted on them by the Israelis, so people who couldn't get enough dialysis, people who couldn't get their diabetes medication, we know that number is going to exceed 150, 180,000. And that number is going to rise as we go through the recovery process, as we go through reconstruction. So it's important to keep in mind, this is the very, very, very bare minimum when we're trying to understand what happened in Gaza, when we're trying to understand how many people have perished. This is just the Ministry of Health looking at people who died from a bomb or from a tank or from a drone strike. It's not taking into account the children who froze to death, the people who died because of the diarrheal illness, because of lack of clean water, the people in the north who couldn't get dialysis, and so they died because the toxins built up in their bloodstream. So it doesn't take that into account. But those are people. And those people are no longer here, and they're no longer here because of the way the Israeli military prosecuted this campaign. Next slide. Again, this is purely when we talk about trucks. There was an obsession with trucks. Our trucks getting in, our trucks getting in, our trucks getting in. First of all, not enough trucks were getting in at any point in the 16 months prior to the ceasefire agreement. And on October 6th, we know that there were 500 trucks entering, 500 trucks of whether it was food or commercial goods or tents or whatever it was, whatever humanitarian aid was entering prior to October 7th, we know that we never got to that level. We barely even got more than half of that until we were well into 2024. And so now when we talk about, I heard Tom Fletcher, who's the head of OCHA, which is the UN Humanitarian Office. He did an interview 2 days ago with the National News. And he said in 20 days, they've been able to bring in 20,000 trucks and mostly food items here. They're still not addressing the shelter needs, and again, we mentioned the gaps with medical supplies and medicines and medical disposables in the central drug storage. But what it should indicate to us is that there was a motivation to deprive the people of Gaza of those things. That just because we were able to get a ceasefire agreement, that means that the Israelis were intentionally starving the population because of how easy it was to continue to bring these trucks in afterwards. And I think UNRWA does a great job in their most recent situation report, just showing us how well they can operate when they're not being targeted. They lost 275 of their employees in 17 months. And the second that the bombs stopped dropping, not all of the bombs, but most of the bombs stopped dropping, we saw them continue to cater to 120,000 people that were in their shelters. We saw them deliver food on a massive level. We saw them be able to get to areas of the most vulnerable Palestinians. And so that's just the food response. And so I think it's important to note that there was a clear motivation here by one entity to deprive the population of Gaza. It's the basic necessities of life. Next slide. So this is another important point I wanted to bring up. This is often cited, like there are 36 hospitals in Gaza. There's 36 hospitals in Gaza. 18 are defunct, 18 are partially functioning. But really, I mean, if we want to take a look at it, some of these hospitals are we would probably not call them hospitals here in the United States. We may call them clinics. We may call them medical centers. But there are really 5 or 6 major hospitals in Gaza that have multiple operating rooms and multiple specialists. And oftentimes you'll see these specialists moving back and forth. Nasser Hospital, where I worked at, is one of these major hospitals, and it was raided, attacked, and many of its workers were either abducted or had to go somewhere else. In fact, yesterday on Democracy Now!, there is Dr. Khalid Dasser, who spent 6 months in prison. I worked alongside him at Nasser Hospital. And somehow, heroically, this young surgeon decided to go back to the place where he was abducted, back to the place where he watched the Israeli military try to destroy. But the thought here that what's important to recognize is, we have a healthcare system that was brought to its knees by a military, and building up that capacity is going to take time. Of course, when you have people like Dr. Hussam Abu Safiya, who was the Kamal Adwan director, when you have him still in prison behind bars, that's the guy that we need out. That's the person that we need leading the response. He knows how to build up a hospital, how to increase the capacity of a NICU, a newborn nursery. We don't, that's as we move forward and we try to address this issue, it's important to realize that, there are members of the workforce and leaders here that we really need at the table while these decisions are being made. Next slide. I'm going to skip through a couple of these quickly. Next slide. This is, of course, one thing I want to say about polio is we're now trying to figure out how to mount the third phase of the vaccinations here. So there are 600,000 kids roughly in Gaza that need to get their third shot. And so, this sort of issue is, I think, important to look at with respect to, how do you get something successfully done like this? Sure, the WHO can call for days of tranquility, and the UN can help bring in the vaccines. But what made this so successful is that Gaza's healthcare community made it a priority. And so whether they sent doctors or nurses to food kitchens, or they sent them to clinics that had the roof blown off, you saw their faces there. They're the ones saying this is important, and families brought their kids out to be vaccinated. So again, any sort of campaign in the future, if you want to replicate this, some sort of success like this, yes, we want the WHO to mobilize resources. Yes, we want the UN to be able to deliver the vaccines. Cold storage needs to be preserved. But the people that you need so that the community has the buy-in, they're the ones who we have to make sure are part of any future campaign, any future response. Next slide. Food insecurity, we kind of touched on. Next slide. I'm going to skip through a few of these. This is just to look at, as we start to combat malnutrition, you always want to think about who the most vulnerable populations are, who will be affected by this. Of course, pregnant and breastfeeding women, you think about that. You think about children who are under the age of 2. So, these are things that you always want to keep track of. Next slide. This is still a major issue. So under the ceasefire agreement currently, the thought was that there was supposed to be diesel. Yes. Oh, got it. Yeah. The diesel fuel was supposed to enter. We saw that that was woefully less than what was promised. We see that the hospitals are able to function off of generators and diesel fuel entering, and that the UN and the WHO seem to be able to get fuel in. But commercially or for residential, still total blackout, total electricity blackout, which is, again, as you talk about recovery and response and trying to get back to some degree of normalcy, fuel is humanitarian aid. I mean, there's no way around it. Trying to transport people, move them back and forth, have some sort of economic growth after everything that's taken place. This is important. Next slide. Next slide. Again, I wanted to bring this up because I think we were all pretty shocked, or maybe not shocked, but we were pretty horrified in November 2023 when Shifa was raided the first time. And this picture is of some of the 38 kids that were in their newborn nursery in their neonatal intensive care unit. And this is a problem that I want to address because I guess I'll just kind of explain it through this story here. Despite the fact that these kids were there, the Israeli military struck the hospital, took out the solar panels, so their incubators no longer had power. And so what the healthcare workers did, actually really kind of brilliant of them, is they had some of these beds that would emit some heat from the beds, and then they would couple all of the kids together. This is really temperature control in this early stage of life is really important. And despite their efforts, during the siege of Shifa, which took place over the course of several weeks, 8 out of the 38 children died. And there was this massive effort to kind of get them transported. Again, over the course of weeks, when we were down to 30, And then 8 of them were able to, what we say, graduate. And so they were kind of reunited with their family members. And then the Red Crescent was able to transport 22 of these kids to Rafah. Now, problem is Rafah does not, they were able to bring them to Nasser. They were able to bring them to Abu Yusuf al-Najjar. The UAE has a field hospital. Problem was there wasn't really a capability of any hospital. Even my hospital in Chicago, which is one of the biggest hospitals, would struggle accepting 22 new NICU babies. I mean, that's a massive load of patients that would be brought in. So the majority of them actually were transferred out to Egypt. And the Washington Post in February, exactly 1 year ago, released a report on these kids. They followed them. And they found that there were 19 of them who have not been reunited with their parents, who have reached 1 year of age, and many of whose parents are believed to be dead and killed. And so one of the more tragic things is some of these kids thought that the Egyptian nurses in Al Arish were their moms. So, this is sort of this, it's a microcosm of this massive attack on children that we saw take place. Dr. Ghassan Abu Sitta talks about the largest cohort of child amputees. We see that, there are still many children who are on this medical evacuation list. UNICEF believes the number is 5,000 people who've been injured or need some sort of emergent surgery. And, the concern is not just the actual medical treatment that we need to provide. It's also the separation of the families, the separation from the communities, the trauma that's not being addressed. And, one thing I'll say is before October 7th, there was a Save the Children report, and I can't remember what the report's name was. But it talked about trauma in children. And I know my colleagues are probably are better suited to talk about this. But the one thing I'll mention is that report had alarming levels of children who were exhibiting behaviors of kids who were dealing with trauma. Everything from bedwetting to self-harm to suicidal ideation. Insane percentage of kids in Gaza. I mean, over 40% were having suicidal ideation. And that's before October 7th. Next slide. I'll wrap up here pretty briefly. Next slide. This is just a sort of like ominous telling. If there's a ceasefire that breaks down, we know that international institutions like the WHO or like the UN have minimal ability to sort of have any sort of influence about access to care. This is just a look at January 1st through 8th when everybody was talking about a potential ceasefire happening and the missions that they had planned for them to kind of access the north or access other parts. And what you saw was that there is, out of these 3, that there's only 1 that was partially facilitated. So they're getting 67% of their missions or delegations rejected. If we go back to the Israelis' full-scale ground invasion, airstrikes, our international institutions have shown for 17 months and moving forward, I don't see any change that there's minimal intervention that they can do and that they aren't really able to have any degree of accountability. And there will be no accountability for all of the missions that have been obstructed or delayed. Next slide. I'll end with this. I mean, this is the final thing I'll say. I think part of the effort, part of the role that we can play as we move forward and talk about rebuilding a health system is combating dehumanization. And I think that's how the Israelis got away with what they got away with. And they, I hope that there can still be some degree of accountability and there can be, people brought to justice for what they did. But it's the fact that when you talk about that there were 439 kids named Ahmad that were killed, that people don't see that. They don't hear the name Ahmad. They don't think about a kid running around. All we hear is the media talk about these numbers, these abstract numbers. They'll say 45,000 Palestinians, but you never get to understand who they were. You don't get to hear the full story of Hind Rajab. You don't get to hear the phone call for 3 hours that she spent with Palestinian Red Crescent begging somebody to come and save her. And so I think, moving forward, one of the things that we can do is when we talk about whatever this final number will be, we really make an effort to elevate who they were. I think that's the way that not only are you able to honor who the Ahmads and Barats and Celines and Hinds and Salmas were, but that you're forcing the perpetrators of this to be confronted with their images, their names, their stories. It's easy to be able to say that that this culture and this society is brought up around extremism and violence. But then when you saw hundreds of thousands of kids in Gaza go back to school 3 days ago, what you saw was their backpacks and their coloring books, and you saw their destroyed schools, and you saw teachers show up and put them in single file lines. I mean, those are the things that I think as Americans, that's part of where our responsibility is to center those stories and center those voices and to make sure that nobody forgets that Hind was on the phone, asking for somebody to save her. And just like you think a 6-year-old who's looking at a tank 50 yards from her, that, she said she was scared and that you had to listen to an operator pray with Hind, say, Hind, repeat after me, say, oh God, please help me, please save me. And I think, the fact that, some people heard that, but not most people heard that. I think that's where we can kind of address some of these issues. I think that's where we can make sure that we can get a permanent ceasefire, and that these are the people that we need to help with any resources possible. The last thing I'll say is, there has been what I said, there was a UN report that came out that talked about medicide, trying to give a definition to like medical genocide. And I think, the way that the Israelis approached healthcare institutions is they violated sort of the sanctity of, a hospital or a clinic or a white coat or a nurse. And I think Dr. Hussam's particular saga is truly tragic, because this is somebody who did everything that was asked of him and bent over backwards to try to keep the hospital standing and the doors open. He's somebody who wrote 2 New York op-eds, New York Times op-eds, 2, 1 year apart. He's somebody who the Israelis came in December of 2023, raided the hospital, they detained him, questioned him, and they let him go. So, I mean, the Israelis, are they that incompetent that suddenly Dr. Hussam, in the 6 or 7 months where they held him, suddenly he became a leader in Hamas, or he's harboring terrorists? The other thing is he had to watch his son be killed in the courtyard of the hospital. He buried his son in the courtyard of the hospital, prayed over his son's dead body, and then we watched him, after they destroyed the hospital, walk up to a tank. And the Israelis, for a long time, I think for 10 days, maybe 9 days, denied that they even had him, even though we saw images of him walking up into the tank. Denied that they even had him. It took Physicians for Human Rights Israel to actually sue, along with Al-Mizan, which is a human rights group, Palestinian human rights group, to sue the Israeli government so that they confirmed that they had him, and of course without charge. And he was still denied a lawyer, even though they said yes, we have him. He was denied a lawyer. He never had any charges against him. Dr. Hussam is one of over 170 healthcare workers in Israeli dungeons right now. He's one of 170 Gazan healthcare workers that are trapped in these dungeons. And if we were to look at the reports from Human Rights Watch about what happens to Palestinians in Israeli prisons, how can we expect the people that we desperately need right now to be leading the response? How can we expect them to be any semblance of normal when they get out? I mean, Dr. Khaled Nasser went into really harrowing detail yesterday. There was a report that came out. Guardian has an article about this. And so I think, again, we're just kind of talking about healthcare, but you can really look at this against any part of society in Gaza, the way that it's been attacked and destroyed, and the people have been either killed, tortured, assaulted. All of it is meant to sort of break the will and break the fabric of society there. And still, despite all of that, we watched 700,000 people walk back on foot to the north to nothing. And so I hope, if there's a call to something that I can ask people to do, is to sort of share, again, the stories that you're familiar with, in the intimate details that you know of people like Dr. Hussam. This is a very easy thing for our elected officials to be able to sign a letter asking for his release. Very easy, Republican or Democrat. Very easy for senators and congressmen to come together and to say, Dr. Hussam needs to be released. And the way the Israelis work is they need to have their wrists slapped to do something. But once they do that, we're able to build off of that and create an actual streamline of people coming out. So Dr. Hussam's release will lead to the release of others. And they know that, and we know this. And that's why this fight is so important. We really need to force their hand on that. And I think that's something that we can do. And I hope, inshallah, God willing, we'll be able to do that soon. So thank you. I appreciate it. I'm sorry, I think I went over time.
Now we'll ask Dr. Bram Wispelwey to come up.
Oh, perfect. Thanks. All right. Try to keep speaking into the mic here for our audience. Oh, so it's actually the other presentation. It's the other one, yeah. Yep. Let me just work on that. Oh, maybe just, there you go. Yeah, works in two directions. So I'm going to try to, I think, complement, Thaer's powerful presentation. Also, what we'll hear later by talking a little bit too contextually, about things before October 7th, but also looking a little bit into the West Bank. And in particular, communities organizing for health in ways that, as you can see here from the title of the talk, right, are defying elimination, right? This logic of elimination that informs, right, and that Thaer really spoke to, I think, again, in a way that was really powerful of what's happening now in Gaza, but also marks the larger project of dispossession of the Palestinian people over many generations. And so go ahead to the next slide. Want to just honor one of community health workers, right? So I'll talk about this community health worker program that's working in 5 refugee camps, working out of community-based grassroots organizations, really in many ways supported by, small dollar donations from committed folks around the world, including in the U.S. But Rasmi Arafat was one of our community health workers who was shot in the chest and killed in October 2023, but in Balata refugee camp in the West Bank. Beloved by his patients, by his fellow CHWs, and by all of us, was an incredible human being and health provider. This was during one of our trauma trainings from that summer of 2023. Next slide. Want to also, just put all of this into a framework of accountability, right? Of course, we're here in the United States, right? This is not. Oftentimes we'll hear the term, right, that the United States is complicit in genocide, but it's not really complicit, right? Complicity is maybe what we have, right, where some of our tax dollars are going towards, right, genocide. But the United States is a majority partner in genocide in this case, right? 70% of the genocide was been paid for by the United States, right? So it's a little bit different than complicity in that sense, right? And so we have to think about our own accountability for those of us who are based in the United States, right? So this is the piece that we wrote in Al Jazeera in November 2023. Right, calling for this exact thing. American doctors should be doing all we can to protect, right, these healthcare workers, right, as they're just, told some of the stories of some of them, right, in Gaza. Why aren't we, right? And that was November 2023, right? And still, despite, really heroic efforts and many things going on, including from Doctors Against Genocide, Dr. Karama, Dr. Nidal, and others, right, we still, the mainstream American medical associations, right, academic, medical centers, institutions are at best silent and at worst actively complicit in censoring and silencing and eliminating hearing from voices of our colleagues in Gaza and throughout Palestine. Next slide. This is from Permission to Narrate from 1982 from Edward Said, right? Facts do not at all speak for themselves, but require socially acceptable narrative to absorb, sustain, and circulate them, right? This idea really that, even when we're talking about the kind of atrocities, we need to be able to situate them responsibly in some kind of larger framework, history, right? History, philosophy, socially, et cetera, right? And that's true for health as well. So next slide, please. So social epidemiologist Nancy Krieger says something very, very similar, which maybe I'll be able to even paraphrase if you can jump to the next slide. It's one thing to observe an association, right, between two variables, cause and effect in health. It's another thing to explain it. This is why theory, causal assumptions, and frameworks are key, not just the observable facts, right? So we may be able to have, some agreement about certain things that have happened in terms of destruction of healthcare, but how are we going to situate that, right, into a larger story that's actually going to motivate a movement for change, right? Next slide. You already saw this slide as well, and I'm just going to give a few personal details. So, most of the places currently, the community health worker program I'm talking about is in Tulkarm and Nur Shams camps in the north, and Balata camp, also in Nablus, and then 2 camps, Aida and Laza camps in Bethlehem. But I actually went to medical school just maybe about 20 miles from the Gaza Strip in Beersheba, which you can see on the map. And next slide. Going to zoom in here, right? So I'll talk a little bit about that. Next slide. I kind of went actually fairly ignorant American at that time. I was going because a partner of mine actually was working for the Legal Center for Arab Minority Rights in Israel, Adallah, which essentially is sort of like the NAACP of Israel. So after law school. Next slide. 2 weeks after I moved there in 2010, there was a village about 10 kilometers from Soroka Hospital where I studied for 4 years. That was destroyed, was demolished, right? These were Palestinian citizens, Bedouin citizens of Israel, called Al-Raqib, right? And kind of was shocked to see this and was sort of like, what's going on here? Got to know this community very, very well, spent a lot of times in particular with 2 families who've continued to keep rebuilding. Next slide. That's actually me as a medical student there with long hair. We used to do weekly protests every Sunday. Next slide. And as you can see, I actually just had to update this with the slide on the right, just with the latest. This was, I think, from earlier this year, has been demolished now, I think something like 235 times since. And there's 2 families that continue to rebuild, right? So again, this is not in Gaza, it's not in the West Bank. These are Palestinian citizens who live right outside Beersheba. Next slide. This really required me to do a lot of work as I got to know this community in particular, of trying to understand how to understand this, how to explain it. And really, this gave me a lens to not only understand that Palestinians really provided to me, as a white settler American, but to also understand my own context and country, right? What Mahmoud Mamdani, the Ugandan scholar, calls the world's first modern settler colonial state, right? The United States. You can see here, this comes actually from one of Mamdani's papers, right? But this was a discussion, the Knesset, right? Sort of Israel's parliament. At the time I was in medical school, right? They were arguing about what was called the Prover Plan, about displacing tens of thousands of Palestinian Bedouin out of their villages, right? And one of the Knesset members says, hey, you want to transfer an entire population? And Miri Regev, who's the current Minister of Transport of the Likud-dominated government, said yes. You can see her there on the left. Yes, as the Americans did to the Indians, right? So it's this shared settler colonial logic really across time and space. Next slide. So thinking about this kind of context, right, where you have, what Patrick Wolf, the historian, has called, the logic of native elimination. What are the health consequences that ultimately develop, right, when you have this displacement and replacement project? Because it's not just about moving people out, sequestering them into small spaces, reservations, Bantustans, the Gaza Strip itself, right, it's 4 miles by 24 miles, right, artificial creation, 80% refugees, right? They're not, originally from Gaza for the most part, okay? Next slide. And you can see here, this goes back to a PBS documentary called Bad Sugar from 2008. The narrator is talking about diabetes, right? So we think about diabetes, right? A metabolic disorder, Pacific Islanders, African Americans, Aboriginal peoples in Australia, they all suffer from type 2 diabetes at rates double or triple the national averages, right? And you have this epidemiologist from Berkeley saying, and they have totally different histories, right? So he's making the point that these are not genetically connected people. They're not biologically connected. They're not culturally connected, right? Maybe across many, many oceans. But he says in all of these far-flung parts of the world, the social circumstance of being ripped from roots ends up with the same manifestation of disease, right? This is not how we're as clinicians, right? I'm an internal medicine doctor, right? We're not taught to think about a distribution of disease in this way, but actually this is what the patterns, if you sort of look at them with the right frame, will ultimately tell us. Next slide. You can see here, right, again, making that comparison between the two contexts, right? We talked about, Thaer showed us some data, right, on mortality from cardiovascular diseases and others, right? These are rates of diabetes, right? And you'll see this too among Indigenous Australian people compared to white settlers. But you can see here, right, the two populations predominantly colonized, right, and displaced, right? In one case, kidnapped and enslaved, right, and displaced from their indigenous locations within West Africa, brought to the Americas, as well as the indigenous peoples who were themselves then displaced to make room for the plantations in which those enslaved people were made to work, right? So you can see diabetes rates, but that's not just diabetes. You'll see that across all different patterns of disease, right, within the settler colonial United States. Similar, right, you can see here in Israel, and even within, right, when we look at Palestinian citizens, you're looking at, almost double rates of diabetes. And then when you get to contexts like, for example, the population we're working with in West Bank refugee camps, dramatically higher rates. So we'll see that across. Next slide. Sure. So we wrote a little bit about this. This was back during COVID too, right? When we knew that there was this deadly synergy, right, between COVID and chronic diseases that were happening. And as in other parts of the world, the prevalence of the disease in these West Bank camps is linked to land dispossession, structural violence, and colonial domination and oppression. Next slide. I remember I showed this slide as part of a talk I was giving to actually high school students, DNA high school students, right? So in the Navajo Nation, when I was a resident working out there, and they were like, oh, I was talking about Palestine, talking about the communities that I was working with, and they were like, oh, we have that exact map. I was like, okay, next slide. This would have been, about 10 years ago. I don't know if you can press play on that. They're like, yeah, that's literally like, they understood immediately this story and its relationship to health, right? Right, and over 300 years, as opposed to about over 100 years in the prior slide, right, in that history, right, and we're left with what? Spatial sequestration in reservations, right, colonially controlled reservations, right, not dissimilar from the situation of having refugee camps throughout occupied Palestine, and also, again, the Gaza Strip itself, right, as that sort of artificial creation. Next slide. Right, in settler colonialism, I won't go into it too much here, but obviously continues to be a reality. Is from Visualizing Palestine. They do a lot of incredible work right across the globe. But also, as you can see in the dark gray, there are many cases, particularly on the African continent, where settler colonialism has been defeated, right, or at least partially defeated. Next slide. Thinking about, southern Rhodesia, Zimbabwe, South Africa, Algeria, over 1 million settlers were forced to leave. I'll just mention this briefly, right? So we talked a little bit about genocide, right? The connection between settler colonialism and genocide has been discussed a lot. This from a South African historian talks here that among all the different forms of colonial oppression, settler colonialism is the most prone to genocidal destruction. You can go to the next slide. Most prone to the genocidal destruction of indigenous peoples, right? So this is well known. This was from 2022. And next slide. The most famous paper in all of settler colonial studies from 2006 by this English historian named Patrick Wolfe called Settler Colonialism and the Elimination of the Native, in which he's really interrogating this connection between settler colonial projects, right, like Israel, right, and the Zionist project that started in the late 19th century, as well as the United States. And what's interesting about this, if you look at the date, is right, this is before the modern siege on the Gaza Strip, right? This is 2006. And he's saying, why even do this theorization about settler colonialism? Why even bother talking about it? He's like, we can interrupt these processes. We know that this is a marker, a risk factor for destruction of, and the summary liquidation of peoples. And so in the cases where settler colonialism is intensifying, and he gives the example of Palestinians in both the West Bank and Gaza, they're at risk right here, right? As they become less and less, right? Gaza and the West Bank become less and less like Bantustans and more like reservations, or for that matter, like the Warsaw Ghetto, right? He's warning almost 20 years ago of the potential for genocide of Palestinians, okay? This is the kind of thing that should have been seen coming, and that there would have been whatever excuse, right? Because this logic of elimination, it doesn't stop, right? It's a zero-sum game, a land-based project that does not allow for the sovereignty of the indigenous peoples at the heart of it, right? Next slide. So when we think about health frameworks, right, we should be able to incorporate these kind of historical framings, right, in these kind of projects. You can see here again from Nancy Krieger that the central question becomes who and what is responsible. We don't do that enough when we're interrogating health data, these kind of health outcomes. When we look at those inequities, right, in diabetes, right, in longevity, in lifespan, in infant mortality, in maternal mortality, whatever it might be, we're not thinking enough about who and what is ultimately responsible, right, in that accountability question. Next slide. We've spent some time at we have a Palestine program for health and human rights between Birzeit University's Institute of Community and Public Health based in the West Bank and Harvard's FXB Center for Health and Human Rights on really trying to interrogate settler colonialism as a major driver of health, right, in the Palestinian context, but also generally across other contexts. Next slide. You can go to the next slide. I won't spend too much time on this, just to make this point that, and it's important, the term apartheid has come up, right? And what ultimately is apartheid, right? So it's a system of racial domination that includes, but is not limited to things like segregation. Think about South Africa, a well-known settler colonial context, and certainly Palestine as well. But apartheid in and of itself, like a system and a structure of domination, it's very important descriptively, right? It's very important legally because unlike settler colonialism, there's ways to challenge it at the international arena. But it doesn't still tell you the ultimate underlying why, right? Which is where settler colonialism is still useful, right? Or what Palestinians often call the ongoing Nakba, right? Or the everyday Nakba, right? So this 1948 wasn't a one-time event, right? There was displacement and dispossession before that. One of the largest uprisings in Palestinian history, 1936 to 1939. And then certainly all the way into the present beyond the Nakba, et cetera. And so here, as you can see, right, even among Palestinian citizens of Israel, right, because of, these social suitability requirements for where you can actually live, extreme limitations on where people can live. So it's everywhere in historic Palestine where Palestinians live, they have fundamentally different sets of rights, right? This is clearly apartheid, but it's driven by this land-based project that we see in all other settler colonial contexts. And we see, right, in the current discourse around settling the Gaza Strip itself, not to mention, of course, the West Bank. Next slide. Oh, maybe one more. These are all the reports. Certainly, Palestinians actually have been using the term apartheid even since the 1950s. There's examples. This slide credit goes to Rania Maharab, who's a scholar of settler colonialism and apartheid, who's our current fellow at the Palestine program. But then, increasing recognition among not just international organizations like Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch, but also Israeli, including B'Tselem and others. Oftentimes, they don't fully connect it to the settler colonial reality, but this increasing recognition of the apartheid situation. Again, this is the underlying background context. Next slide. Importantly, right, and this goes back to the Brazzaville Declaration of 1981 and a WHO organized meeting there. 45 years ago, it was stated very clearly that apartheid is not consistent with health and it's incompatible, right? These are incompatible and mutually exclusive. So the fundamental agreed upon across all organizations now that are human rights organizations context in Palestine is a situation in which health is not and well-being are not fundamentally possible, right? And Thaer gave some data also that already showed that. So like this is the kind of thing that, again, it shouldn't take then the development into from an apartheid context into outright genocide for us to be fundamentally as health professionals and as health communities fighting against this. Next slide. So now I'm going to just transition a little bit from there. So obviously this is okay, so these are some of the frameworks that we might want to be using and thinking about when we're talking about health. And I think especially, right, certainly you have the context of the immediate needs, right? And the importance of delivering healthcare, right, in this context, right, which is heroically happening both in Gaza and the West Bank. But then also in the long run, right, we have to think about this overall geopolitical context, right? What are the ways in which simultaneously to be addressing health, but also be thinking about how to resist, right, against this settler colonial elimination. And I think particularly, right, there's a huge push right now, as I'm sure many of you know, right, there was already the outright banning of UNRWA, and a project right now of actually emptying out the refugee camps in the West Bank, right? So this is an ongoing project. And so, as I believe it was Deborah Rose Bird once said, right, in order to get in the way of settler colonialism, all the native needs to do is to stay home, right? And so many ways, I think the call to action at this point too is to find ways, right, in terms of health interventions, to think about how to simultaneously allow for remaining, right, in some cases in a displaced community like a refugee camp, but that refugee camp represents, even as a displaced community, ultimately the future enactment of the right of return, right? That will happen when Palestinians go back to their home villages, which will happen. Next slide. So here are some of the camps I mentioned that Health for Palestine is working in, right? These are all refugee-run community health projects. This is Ida Camp on the left and Al-Aqsa Camp on the right. It's about 5,500 and 2,500 people respectively in Bethlehem. Very high population density. Next slide. Because Balata is the next one, which is the largest refugee camp in the West Bank, so 30,000 in Nablus. Are you able to go to the next slide? Oh, sorry. This is actually Ida. It's a photo I took a number of years ago. Originally, right, there were tents, then there was cinder blocks. It was established in 1950, and then sort of increasing building up, right? And there's no ability to go to expand outward. In fact, actually, a lot of Ida's land was taken by the apartheid wall, and so you see just sort of increasing, right? So extreme population density in what is already a very population dense area. Next slide. That's the wall. Next slide. And the land that was taken, that's Balata, so 30,000, so enormous. Next slide is Tulkarm, 21,000, and again, a very small space. Now, 90% of Tulkarm and Nur Sham's camp have been ethnically cleansed just in the last few weeks. Okay. Tens of thousands of people, at least 40,000 people in the north of the West Bank, also in Jenin, have been ethnically cleansed. This is happening really right now. This would be sort of enormous, sort of news story in sort of quote unquote normal times, but has been largely ignored. Next slide. Again, you can see here just Ida Camp, which is not even the most population dense compared to the most population dense cities in the world, just to give a sense of what that context is. Next slide. Ida is also, according to a study by UC Berkeley, the most tear gas exposed population in the world. Tear gas is illegal under the Chemical Weapons Convention, the Geneva Convention, and so you can't use it in war, but you can use it domestically, right? There's no reason domestic. So predominantly settler colonies like the United States use it against Black and brown peoples who are protesting, and then in Israel use it really regularly against Palestinians. So essentially everyone's been exposed. Next slide. So the problem is because of those bans, it's actually not very well understood how dangerous it is. It looks like the slide didn't come through, but it's mostly American-made tear gas. And again, very poor data, but there are probably chronic health implications that we don't fully understand, including lung diseases. Next slide. And if you get, trapped within, a small space, which happened this was in Ida a few years ago, a woman died from exposure to tear gas. Next slide. And then, so these overall, like, the underlying conditions, within these refugee camps, sort of constant invasion. There are home invasions almost nightly in many cases, usually happen around 3 a.m. This is just part of sort of the colonial project of keeping a population sort of on its toes, right? Particularly when you have a relatively small number of soldiers trying to control a large indigenous population. Many of these techniques were actually learned during the British Mandate period. From the British's own experiences with colonized populations in India and elsewhere, and going back all the way to Ireland. Next slide. So essentially, right, this community health program operates with sort of three main components. There's, of course, a biomedical focus in terms of community health workers are mostly like really brilliant young folks who are very well educated, working on diabetes, hypertension, starting now a pediatric program as well. Also focus on trauma-informed care and then political education and community mobilization. So really organizing amongst themselves across the camps during what, is a period of time when you'd think you would probably have to scale back work. Actually, they've really expanded the work. Why? You have situations like the UNRWA being destabilized, right? The overall situation worsening because this is all camp organized activity from within the refugee camps. They've been actually able, and the need has been to expand it. And so they actually pushed to start new projects within Tulkarm and Nur Shams during what is one of the worst times in living memory. Next slide. So these are just some of the, you can go ahead to the next slide, some of the key sort of health areas working on. This is kind of what it looks like. This is in Ida camp, what we call social accompaniment, right? Is sort of, meeting people where they are in their homes, making sure they have their medications, getting them to their appointments, all the kind of things in a very fractured, fragmented environment, right? We know, even in West Bank, even where they maybe have 90% of essential medications, on average, or often stockhouse, so making sure people have their medications organized in pillboxes, et cetera. Because with these chronic diseases, right, it's very difficult, even the best of circumstances, to manage. And doctors aren't very helpful, right, for diabetes. Diabetes is something people live with themselves, right, and their families day in, day out. They're only seeing a doctor, best case scenario, every few months, right? And so community health workers can really bridge that gap and have been shown to be very effective in many contexts around the world, including now in refugee camps experiencing chronic violence. Next slide. This is in Tulkarm from the newest team kind of that we've been working with. The next slide. And overall, now you can see here the different sites that we're working with, and then a few hundred patients as well. Next slide. There's about 8 community health workers per camp, more or less. We've had now one community health worker was killed in Tulkarm a few months ago. She was actually responding to attacks on local residents within the camp. Was killed alongside her 2 daughters. Next slide. By a drone, an armed drone. We've had actually really impressive diabetes outcome results. And so a reduction in hemoglobin A1C, about 1.4 compared to sort of control patients, refugee camps who don't have a community health worker. Not really surprising, right, if you think and look at other programs around the world that do this kind of work. Next slide. Maybe next slide. Is there another? Oh, perfect. 5 minutes, perfect. Okay, yeah, I'll be wrapping up soon. So I mentioned this already, right? So UNRWA is still continuing as best they can, right, in the West Bank, despite being banned by Israeli parliament. But as we're seeing now, tens of thousands of people are being moved out. They've already been told that they won't be able to return. We have tanks that are now in these camps, right? And already, I think it was, Hubert, when we were in Tulkarm in November, I think there had been something like 160 invasions by the military since October 7th. It was essentially once every 2 or 3 days. When we first tried to go to meet with the team there, we couldn't go because the army was in the camp. And there was basically about a 16-hour window between sort of invasions. And so we were able to eventually go and to be there with the team. Next slide. But essentially, dramatic levels of violence that they've been experiencing. The community health workers have been delivering babies because, there's total lockdown. People can't get to hospitals, can't get to clinics, and all the exits and entrances are often blocked by the military intentionally, and so folks can't get out. This goes back to actually Gaza. This was from December 2023 of this another mass displacement, right, north to south. Next slide. But this is exactly what we're also now seeing, right? You can see here on the right. This is from Jenin, right, and this is from 1967. So again, these histories of dispossession, displacement continue to unfold and are currently happening again right now in the West Bank, similar to what we saw in Gaza over the last year and a half. Next slide. Just to again make the point that this kind of thing, is not unexpected, right? This is from the chair of English at Mount Holyoke College, Eco Day, who's a scholar of settler colonialism, who mentions here, right, this is again in 2015, the illegal occupation, siege of Gaza, and ongoing construction of settlements in the West Bank is an uncanny corollary to the lead up to the 1830 Indian Removal Act, which relocated tens of thousands of people from southeastern nations east of the Mississippi, so the Chickasaw, Choctaw, Cherokee, Creek, and Seminole peoples, right? And so again, she's predicting and warning that this all is looking like it's leading one place, right? To mass displacement. So this is the kind of thing we should have seen coming. Next slide. This was from when I was last in the West Bank in November a few months ago. And you can see, right, this is in Tulkarem camp on the left. That was a photo I took that, parts of it obviously are looking increasingly what people have been calling the Gazification of the West Bank. On the right, this was a home that was demolished with an F-16, right? So they're attacking with planes and bombs in these West Bank camps, again, which has not been seen since 2002 in the Second Intifada. And so they were showing us all of these locations. You can see the tarps up there, which they have to put up because there's so many drones, armed drones going through. They're actually tons of bullet holes. I'm not sure if you can see in the tarps. That's the only way they can feel even a semblance of basic security as they walk down the streets because of all the drones going overhead, which are often shooting people. So that's just many of these homes are currently being demolished. The community health workers actually, on WhatsApp are just sending videos of the demolitions that are happening now. So I think the plan and project seems to be to literally just be destroying the camp right now. Next slide. This is Mohammad, one of the community health workers, also in Tulkarem, who was really heroic and actually was profiled by the New York Times somewhat surprisingly a couple weeks ago, who was trying to rescue a woman who had been shot in the head and unfortunately didn't survive, and was shot in his finger and his femoral artery. He actually almost bled out. His hemoglobin was 3 when he got to the hospital. He's still trying to learn now to walk again. We had this sort of privilege of meeting him in the hospital back in November, and is very committed to sort of returning to work despite everything. But the danger and that they're willing to face and the heroism is really incredible. And again, what's happening in the West Bank and the North is unfortunately eerily similar to what's been happening in Gaza. Next slide. Ultimately, too, right, as I mentioned, this work, we're actually currently fundraising for a pediatric and trauma-informed care. And so just wanted to put that out there as well. If you're looking for ways to support these community health workers, 1 for 3. And that's where I'll stop. Perfect. 1 minute left. Thanks.
If you have any questions, please just raise your hand so that we know who to get
Good.
questions to. Thank you.
Is this good? Okay. Can you hear me okay? Yeah. Okay. You. Alrighty. Okay. How's everyone doing? Okay. So I am a psychiatrist by trade. So I deal with a lot of feelings, mostly every day. And so I think everyone's feelings have been all over the place the past couple of years, since October 2023, but before that as well. And as a Palestinian diaspora, checking about feelings has been part of our existence since I was born. So I was born as a refugee in Beirut, in Lebanon, as a stateless refugee in Lebanon. You're not allowed to have a Lebanese citizenship. They give you a little brown piece of paper that you can use for travel. It's called the travel document, which confused most airports in the world. They just, what is this? It used to be handwritten. Now it's electronic. but it was a big ordeal. And then the conversation we had at home when I was a kid is there will be a pathway to go back. We just don't know how yet. And our lives were thought of as a sequence of events that eventually will inch us a little closer to our land. That's a narrative we lived with as children. So part of my life journey was to leave Lebanon, Beirut, and find a way to go back to Palestine. So I popped up in the US, and so I'm now a US citizen. So hopefully that can get me back to Palestine. I've never been to Palestine ever, actually, ever. So that's the hope, is one day we'll be able to at least go visit, and let alone return, maybe. My work with the Gaza ordeal has been part of my identity as a Palestinian, of course. But I also have family in Gaza who recently evacuated. I also, back in 2014, assembled with a group of activists and decided to start a social media campaign around the trauma in Gaza to support people. It's still on Instagram and on Facebook. It's called Bisalami. And it was good. We talked about trauma modules. It's on YouTube. You can listen to it. And every cycle of violence, I would push the content and recreate it and revamp it. But this time around, I was stuck. I wasn't able to push content or circulate it because I felt that this is not a solution or an answer or really anything. And the reason is we don't know what to do in genocide. I know what to do for trauma. I know how to work around nightmares and PTSD and help kids who are bedwetting. But what do you do for genocide? We don't have a lot of data about how to do with that. And then, would it be even possible to heal from genocide? And what would that look like, even, to heal from genocide? And is that healing, right? In the words of famous psychologist Winnicott, who coined the term good enough mothering, a good enough mother. There is no perfect mother, right? But good enough, that a mother who cares and pampers and hugs and, yes, sometimes yells, but gives food and warmth and love, right? Good enough mothering. I wonder what is good enough healing from genocide. And I think this is what we're all kind of working on and discovering. It's different for everyone how to navigate this journey. But one thing we know for a fact is it will involve a lot of grief, right? And grief, not like in the, what's like the Google thing that you know, the stages of grief, denial, and then, not that kind of grief, you know? But grief that is intertwined with your soul and personality and being every day. You know, I've changed since the genocide in Gaza as a person. There are things that I don't enjoy as much in life as much anymore. And I've kind of had to ask myself, am I clinically depressed? You should know, you're a psychiatrist, you should know if you're depressed or not. You know, and it's okay to be depressed, you know. But I came to the conclusion that this is not just it's not just like, quote unquote, depression. This is, you've been changed by genocide. And I've learned to be okay with that and to celebrate whatever I can celebrate and enjoy life as a Palestinian. Because as Palestinians, we are alive and they cannot erase us. And this is what this genocide showed us, right? And to quote the words of Mahmoud Darwish, the one and only, the famous Palestinian poet, the seeds of a dying spike of grain will fill the veil of wheat. So we are, filling the veil of wheat as Palestinians. Wherever we go, we speak about Palestine. We feed people maklube and msakhan, if you've had those. And we're everywhere in the world. And in the US, we're speaking about Palestine and raising our voices. But today I'll be focusing a little bit about the children of Gaza, the children's mental health in Gaza, so we can share some thoughts together. Slide, please. So this is what typically happens when you have a disaster situation that is not a genocide or an occupation. Right. We have two things happening to the Palestinians in Gaza and in the West Bank now. We have not just a genocide, but one that is perpetrated by an occupation. That's a little different, just a genocide or just an occupation. Typically, when you have a disaster, you have a pre-disaster baseline, and then you have the impact of the disaster. So if you're talking about like a hurricane or a war that subsides and goes away, or an earthquake, think about those kind of things. Then you have a honeymoon where there's more cohesion for the community. And then there's a phase that you call disillusionment. And then you slowly wake up and you come to terms with the grief, loss of spaces, loss of memories, loss of people. And then you have a reconstruction, new beginning. If you try to apply that to the Palestinian cause in Gaza and the West Bank, you will be quickly faced with a challenge. What is our baseline? We don't have a baseline that we can say, oh, now we're back to normal. Great, right? So this is why the classical concepts in psychology many times don't apply to us as Palestinians, in Gaza or otherwise. Why? Because the definition of resilience, for example, in psychology, is that you're able to bounce back to where you before the incident happened. But what we're starting with is not a great place in the first place. So it doesn't really apply as much. So this is why Western research about mental health and constructs like PTSD, for example, or complex PTSD are not very accurate, specific descriptions of what is happening here. It might be something else. Slide, please. So this is why, a lot of scholars, including Palestinian scholars like Dr. Samah Jabir, who's used to be the head of the mental health department in the Palestinian Authority, when she was asked about the rates of PTSD and trauma and depression in the West Bank and Gaza, which, as my colleague said, were astronomical, she questioned those numbers. And she said, I think they're measuring social psychological pain and suffering. And they're saying this is depression. What is sick? The context or the person? In Palestine, we see many people whose symptoms, unusual emotional reaction or behaviors are a normal reaction to a pathogenic context. There is no post in the PTSD because the trauma is repetitive and ongoing and continuous. In the words of the one and only Frantz Fanon, if it is society that is sick, then it is society that needs to be replaced. Another famous quote here, if we call it residential school syndrome, and this is referring to the indigenous Americans, we're still labeling that person pathological rather than the process pathological. Why don't we call it a genocide response? That's a better term to use, a genocide response. So as we are always asked, in the Gaza Mental Health Foundation, mental health program, what should we do to help people in Gaza as mental health clinicians? I think addressing these faulty names of disorders would be a place to start. And taking that to public discourse and academic circles and changing the labels and calling things what they are. A genocide response is a better term than PTSD. Another model that is better than PTSD, the wounds inside. by Rita Jackaman, who's a Palestinian scholar, referring to how we conceptualize mental health and centering the political determinants of health, which is not talked about as much. But in our case, it's a central circle that really has to be shined on and addressed. The next slide, please. This is the slide I was referring to. The political determinants of health. Right. Slide. And to put things back in perspective, Gaza is mostly refugees, right? 70%. And what that translates to is that these people have a similar narrative about where they live and what their hope is for the future. The hope is return. In the aftermath of October 7th, I was watching some of the videos that came out. And on October 7th, there are a lot of videos that came from Gaza. One stuck in my head for a reason. There was chaos, and people from Gaza just left the cage, and they were just wandering around. And one man was sobbing, crying, just an average man was sobbing, crying. And he was saying, our land. This is our land, Bir Sabah. This is our land. These are villages. And we're crying and sobbing tears. He wasn't carrying a weapon or a stick or nothing. He just missed his land. And he was weeping over that. So people live with that, and then it's an ongoing cycle of being a refugee, because now the refugee has resettled to another refugee camp in a tent, somewhere else. So in a sense, this is a re-traumatization, but also in a sense, this is concentrating resilience. It's concentrating the idea that even that building we lived in the refugee camp in Gaza, is also temporary. That even whatever they built for us is temporary. And the goal is to cross that cage and go back to our land. Slide, please. Right. So more about Gaza. I think a lot was said about that. I'll skip that one. Slide, please. So some data about mental health in Gaza and the West Bank. You can read those numbers, but I want to highlight the one in the yellow box, right? This was a study that was done in the West Bank, looking at suicidal ideations and suicide attempts. Not just the thoughts, but like to try to hurt yourself with the hope of dying, right? And these are studies this study was done in high school, and the results showed that 25% roughly had suicide ideations and 25% had suicide attempts. 1 in every 4 high school students had tried to hurt themselves. And males were more at risk than females in this study. Typically in the Western construct, you don't have that high of a rate. And usually females have more attempts than males, and males tend to have more dramatic and serious attempts than females. That's Western data. But in this study, males were more at a high risk. And if you read between the lines, you understand what happens in the West Bank. Roughly about 40 to 50% of all males in the West Bank who are old teenagers, young men, they've been arrested and contained or dealt with the legal system in the Israeli prisons. So you talk about dehumanization, torture, they see it, they know it's coming. So it's part of the male Palestinian experience. As you become of age, you know that this is 50% gonna be my fate. So that could explain one of the reasons. Slide, please. I'll go through this. This is just showing how things were before the genocide in Gaza, and things were not great. There is a big deficit in psychopharmacology and medications used for psychiatric patients, and then maintaining the clinical skill set for clinicians in Gaza by training them from Western trainers isn't always successful or feasible, or even sometimes not very logical. Because the same modalities that we do here, like breath work or relaxation or yoga, might not apply to the Palestinian context in Gaza. I saw an image of a video of a woman in Gaza surrounded by the shrouds, but of her dead children, and people were weeping and wailing, and then it popped up in her head to recite the verse from the Quran that says, the meaning of which is that the prophets and the honored ones who follow the footsteps of the prophets, whenever they're hit with a calamity, they stand steadfast and they fight back. And that calmed the crowd who was wailing. So spirituality is a big part of healing and coping for the Palestinians in Gaza. And the Western trained psychologist, a clinician, doesn't necessarily have that lens all the time. Slide, please. I'll skip that one too. This is from before. Right. So we know the data. These are just estimates. We will find out more. We'll probably get more numbers, unfortunately. But 90% of children are now displaced, many multiple times. And if you look in the back, there's a report from the Gaza Community Mental Health Program. There are reports in the back on the table. You can scan it, you can read it. But it has stories about those displacements. There's a story of Ala, who is a 7-year-old boy who was severely injured and burned from a strike. And then he was displaced to a Norwa school with his family. And the Norwa school was bombed with the Israeli bombs, and he lost all his family. And then he went to Shifa Hospital. And Shifa Hospital was raided, and he had to evacuate while sick with other patients and walk, quote unquote, the last mile, called the last mile. And then he got to be in a tent with no one in his family. So these are like the stories of this. When we say this multiple times displaced, this is what this means, right? And then we talked about 1% of children are amputees now in Gaza. So big need, and it's getting worse. Slide. And then there is malnutrition, which is not talked about as much. But this was in Gaza before the genocide, because Israel calculates the caloric intake that is estimated for the population in Gaza, right? And it was calculated to be at the brink of survival, to not allow the population to prosper and grow more than, quote unquote, Israel wants them to grow. But the prevalence, this is in the recent past few months, it was about 16.6%. That's clinically significant malnutrition. The severe malnutrition was about 7%, and the moderate was about 10%. So pretty scary numbers. Slide, please. Some of the active groups on the ground doing mental health work, UNRWA, WHO, GCMHP, ANERA, and I'll mention some of those very briefly. Slide. So the WHO gave a lot of meds and did a lot of mental health, psychosocial support. Slide. UNRWA, one of the biggest on the ground, despite all the bombings on the schools in UNRWA and trying to ban UNRWA, they're still doing great work and housing. Most of people are displaced internally at the schools. Slide. This is the Gaza Community Mental Health Program. Like I said, you can scan the barcode and read the reports, but doing great work, giving psychological first aid, stress management, and then specialized mental health care. Specialized mental health care this is the fourth row. These are the folks, the patients who are really not doing well at all. So someone who's getting psychotic, or someone who can't take care of themselves, someone who needs more intervention. Slide. So what are some recommended actions to put things, in a practical term. So Gaza is still predominantly food insecure. And I think one of the major things we can help Gaza with is to make Gaza mainstream in our communities. I'd like to see different stores having donation boxes for Gaza. Wherever you go, you see Gaza. Stickers where you can scan the barcode and donate money for Gaza. You can do that in Cambridge. You can do that in Boston. You can do it anywhere. You can talk to an area, ask them permission to get the barcode, so people can actually start visibly seeing Gaza everywhere they go. And of course, in your local community, your church, you can do a food drive. You can get vitamins. And then send missions to collect and publish stories of torture for the prisoners, the hostages who were released from Israeli jails and prisons. And I'm not going to tell the details of the torture stories because they're horrific, including rape. And then you can do toy drives for kids in Gaza. Those are easy to make, and that also would pull more community support and love and solidarity. Heal Palestine, PCRF, doing great work. And then I'm shamelessly put a plug here for the Gaza Mental Health Foundation. Yeah, Nancy here. And if you have any questions about the Gaza Mental Health Foundation, let us know. Another great organization to support and donate money to. With that, I'll stop here. Thank you.
All right, well, looks like maybe we're
For
collecting
those
some
of you on
cards.
Zoom,
We're
free
going to
to
also
put your
have
questions down into chat.
Karama Kumele. I apologize. From Doctors Against Genocide.
All right. Thank you, Bram, Thaer, Dr. Othman. I'm very shocked that I do not know you. So I'm very happy to meet you. So I just wanted to say a few things, and then people will have questions. So I want to thank MAPA for holding the space for us here to experience the testimonies from all the doctors, to experience the courage and the resistance, and to be able to arise for justice together. I'm a Palestinian, and I'm also a doctor. I'm a pediatric neurologist, and I am against genocide, and I'm against injustice. And I speak from a deep space of grief and rage, a lot of rage, because that is the natural emotional reaction to what is happening. For the past year, I watched my colleagues in Palestine, the people who are trained to heal, become the target of systematic extermination. The hospitals turned into graveyards, and the patients burned alive in their beds, and children shot in the head by snipers. I work with Bram in the refugee camps, and Rasmi is a personal friend of mine, and he was killed by an Israeli sniper even before all that is happening. And I think this genocide has been ongoing for a century. It just ebbs and flows. And we have seen a massively destructive chapter in the genocide, and it has not ended. Let's not think that the ceasefire ended the genocide. It really did not. And yet, through all these stories that we hear, there is one thread that emerges. It's the courage to care. And thank you for all of you for having the courage to care, because we are being intimidated, and we are being silenced and censored, and we are threatened with our jobs and with our livelihood, so that we do not care and we do not speak up. So I thank you from the bottom of my heart. It is not easy to be here, and you are brave to care. Thank you. And now we are seeing that the war and the attack on health is spreading from Palestine to us here in Turtle Island. We are seeing a war on health in different forms. Medicaid is gutted, hospitals are closing, and medical care is denied, and research is defunded. Healthcare is being stripped away from those who need it most. The communities of color, the poor, the disabled, the LGBT communities, and all that while corporate greed turns suffering into profit. And one important thing that I really urge you to do. We are in Boston. We have some of the best hospitals in the world. And who sits on the table making decisions in these hospitals? On the board of Mass General Hospital, MGB, sits one board member who happens to be the CEO of Lockheed Martin, James Takelet. He leads one of the largest weapon manufacturers in the world, and he earns $22 million per year. Why? Why is he at Mass General? The man that profits off the bombs that flatten hospitals in Gaza has a say in how our hospitals operate here. The same hand that fuels war and destruction holds the purse strength of our healthcare institutions. This is not just a conflict of interest, it's a fundamental moral failure. Please sign our petition from Doctors Against Genocide. We want to remove this board member from Mass General Hospital. Our institutions have failed us, our societies have failed us, our associations have failed us. We have to create our own institutions, our own communities that are just and that are moral. So we refuse to be bystanders, and we will be upstanders together. Please stop by the Sick from Genocide table. We are all sick from genocide. We have an expert here on what it means to experience the sick from genocide symptoms. We have a brochure that has a lot of information, and we will continue to hold sick from genocide clinics and pop-up clinics called Kamal Adwan Hospital, where medical professionals and community members meet together to talk about their feelings and support each other. The only cure for being sick from genocide is to end the genocide. And we end the genocide by organizing, pushing back, speaking truth to power, and not letting people like Takelet make all this money while he is sending weapons to kill children. So please join us, healthcare workers for Palestine, Doctors Against Genocide. We are working together on these campaigns, Sick from Genocide, and the other campaign is Not Another Child, Not Another Hospital. And that is sent to all the CEOs, the health leaders of health throughout the country here in the United States. So we refuse to be silent. We pressure our government, and we replace it if it does not work. And we expose the ties between the war profiteers and healthcare institutions. And we also, I have to invite you to join us. We at Doctors Against Genocide, we have meetings with our representatives, our senators, our congressmen, and we talk about this particular issue, that health should be just and moral, and we should not send our tax dollars to kill people in Gaza and Palestine. So if you are ever interested in experiencing civic duties, like people say it here, and you want to come with us to Washington, D.C., it is quite an experience. We go as a healthcare coalition together, and we have meetings, and we have asks and demands. We also have a petition that I urge you to sign, also at the Sick from Genocide Clinic. Thank you, Bram. Thank you, Dr. Othman. And Thaer, is he gone? Oh, okay. For being here. It's always inspiring to hear you speak, because this is real medicine. Thank you.
Hi, I am so grateful to be here today. Thank you, Bram. Thank you, Karama. Uh, Thank you, Othman, and thank you, Thaer. I think he's off to Seattle to speak. In addition to the different healthcare organizations, we've been sponsored by many different local Boston organizations and or local chapters of national organizations, and one of them is the Alliance for Water Justice. I am going to introduce Judy Andler to speak for the Alliance for Water Justice in Palestine, and she's my friend, and I'm really, really honored to have her here today.
I want to thank MAPPA, and I want to thank everybody on the panel. Okay. I'm not used to this. Sorry, I don't do a lot of public speaking. Is that better? Okay. So I just want to thank everybody who spoke. And I think at the outset, the most important thing for me to say on behalf of the Alliance and Nancy Murray and even Hubert, if you have anything to add, because I'm not a health person, Nancy and Hubert are involved in 1 for 3, the Gaza Mental Health Center, and can bring a lot more information. But just in the few minutes that I have, I want to start by saying that for the Alliance, a reason that I feel I'm here is to take all of the information that everyone on the panel has given us today, so that the Alliance can do, to quote different people from the panel, to elevate it, to speak truth to power, as the doctor just said. And that's our work, and our work is to figure out how do we do that. And we work with other activist organizations locally, which I'll just talk briefly. So one thing is I want to say, and I don't need to tell you, but that had genocide been a legal concept in 1887, that is exactly when Zionism committed its first 2 acts. When Chaim Weizmann said that they had to appropriate the land of Palestine for Western European Jews, Zionists must eliminate the Palestinian population from the land. And to do this, Zionists must take control of every source of water. For every source of water from the river to the sea and beyond. And he sent a cartographer to begin work to do this. Briefly, the Alliance began in 2013 when Palestinian rights activists who had been working together, came together with several other organizations, including MAPPA and the Jewish Voice for Peace, to stop the Massachusetts Governor Deval Patrick's campaign to establish the innovative partnership between Makarot and Massachusetts. Makarot, as you probably know, is a state agency of Israel that has been the machine that has driven Israel's water apartheid policies for decades and still does. That water partnership then would have further cemented Israel and Massachusetts' relationship. The funding would have been used for research and for infrastructure, and both Israel and the Massachusetts would have profited from them. It would have greenwashed the truth and continued to redirect and destroy Palestinian water sources, and diverted funds that really should have been used then to restore water justice to Palestine. 20 years later, this still exists. We stopped the partnership. But in the last 20 years, certainly new challenges that are the consequences of Israel's water apartheid policies have exacerbated, and that's what we're dealing with today. For the campaign in 2013, the Alliance stood out on the State House. We met with legislatures, sent hundreds of postcards that we collected statewide, and even read a letter to Governor Patrick when he appeared on a public radio, from a West Bank teenager who basically said in his letter, told the governor to stop killing Palestinians, to stop stealing our water. From that campaign on, the Alliance undertook an agenda that calls out and challenges Israel's 100-year regime of water apartheid policies. This is done when this is maintained by settlers. It is maintained by the IDF, and it is maintained by the Israeli government. So we exist to tell this story, and especially now to tell the stories that people have brought today. What I just want to briefly say in the last minute is that our next event is going to be World Water Day on March 20th. I have flyers at the back. March 22nd. Sorry, Saturday, March 22nd in downtown Crossing. I have flyers. You can go to our website, and I also want to encourage people to look to our social, all of our social media. And if you come to me after this, I can take your email and sign you up for for all of our mailings. Thank you.
And Tony Ann right now is going to do some questions out of the chat box from Zoom, and then we're going to go to questions from the audience.
Testing, testing.
Tough work.
Yeah. Excellent.
Zoom questions are going first. So if you have a question for Zoom, this is last call.
Oh yeah. Oh yeah. She was the first one that study, so yeah.
Oh, speak. Sorry.
All right. So our first question from Zoom for our panelists is, how do things get to Gaza? How do things get to Gaza when you donate?
Short answer is with difficulty. With great difficulty. Yeah, so there are organizations, US-based organizations. So you can donate to these US-based organizations, and these, like ANERA, for example, Norwa, they have different branches, different parts of the world. So essentially, they can mobilize money that way. But all these organizations, when they send money to Gaza, you have to vet, who's giving you the money and where the money is going to. An extremely excruciating process. And then, and now it's been more difficult now because the banks in Gaza have been destroyed. So it is very difficult to find the local bank to send the money to if you want to send money. But it's very difficult. But if you are giving money to a reputable organization, then rest assured it's going to Gaza, but it's going to be difficult. So be generous with the administrative donation. If they say give 10% to cover the admin fees, know that it is really a challenge, and those admin fees are really important. But it gets there. It gets there.
All right, Tony Ann is going to help out with the mic. In the meantime, I'm going to move on to the next question. It says, do you have advice for American mental health care professionals with clients struggling with issues such as moral injury or vicarious trauma or survivor's guilt related to the genocide?
Yeah, so that's a tough one, I guess. Another tough one. So I can tell you, I've never in my career, and I've been doing this for a minute, being a child psychiatrist, adult psychiatrist, never have I seen, kids from white families come to me upset, agitated about the political environment in Gaza. But this year, I see kids come to see me like upset, agitated, and the parents trying to calm them down. Like, tell him something to calm him down because he's always angry about Gaza. Well, good job. It's my first thought. Good job. But right, I think as one of my mentors used to say, anger is an initial feeling and a very superficial feeling. But when you feel anger, that means that you're onto something. So you gotta see what's beyond that. Are you angry because your family doesn't hear you? Are you angry because you're lonely? Are you angry because you feel helpless? You gotta unpack the feeling to figure out how to help people, right? If you're lonely, and I get that a lot from people who come to see me who feel lonely, like I'm the only one in the family. Well, find your tribe, reach out, see who's being active in the community, right? Speak up. So I guess you have to unpack kind of what's going on to help these people.
Thank you. All right, we have another question. Why are Palestinians not considered human enough by the West? There was no restriction from the American and European powers to stop Israel's genocide.
It's a big question. The dehumanization, right? The anti-Palestinian racism, it's deeply embedded. There's many reasons for it in the West, but I think, part of the story, right, is I think, what I was getting at with these histories, right, of colonization, right? The histories of colonization and racialization go hand in hand, right? And dehumanizing people by putting them within a racial hierarchy, right, and essentializing them as other, as different, as inferior, is a way to rationalize colonial modes of domination, right? Whether for exploitation, right, and exploitation of labor in particular, or elimination, right, to be able to expropriate their land. And so what we see with the dehumanization of Palestinians is the same, or similar in many respects to dehumanization of indigenous peoples, right, Black folks, the world over, and in contexts like the United States that are dominated still by settler institutions and settler populations, right, white supremacy, white settler supremacy, and patriarchy, that dehumanization comes very naturally, right, because they've naturalized and normalized their own control and domination within these societies and these forms of oppression. And so, when we take delegations and have taken delegations to Palestine, right, it takes no time at all for Black folks and Native folks, in my experience, to recognize what they're seeing when they go to Hebron, for example, in the West Bank. Also Irish folks, frankly, even as people who became racialized ultimately as white, certainly in context of North America. White people struggle, in my experience, a lot more, and it takes them more time to kind of figure out. They're like, wait a minute, but this can't actually be what's happening here, right? You can't actually have two different streets for two peoples, or Palestinians have to walk on this road while Jewish Israelis can drive, because they don't have that experience, right? They've sort of developed sort of liberal, friendly narratives of ultimately, even when they're sort of progressive, within contexts like the United States and have not sort of fully grappled with these kind of historical and ongoing realities, which folks of color, specifically, right, Black folks and Native folks, have no choice but to understand from very early ages. And so what's happening, obviously, in Palestine and, U.S. support for Israel, I think, is very tied up in these dynamics, right? And in Israel, ultimately, too, there's a lot of focus sometimes on questions of lobbying, right, within the United States, but ultimately, the United States not doing anything it doesn't want to do, right? Israel serves purposes, and it's been willing to serve these purposes for imperial powers, whether Britain, right, or now the United States, right? So, they've engaged and led dirty, work and counter-revolutionary work in Latin America and all over at the behest of the United States, right? So I think it's important to understand that it's not a question of why hasn't Western Europe or the United States stood up and said something, right? This is part of the ongoing imperial project that those countries are still very much benefiting from, right, and extracting wealth from the rest of the world out of. And so I think that shift in frame then helps us understand the broader struggle for many different peoples that are necessary in order to also simultaneously liberate Palestine. That'll be my slightly too long answer.
No, you're good. That was a big question. All right. So we have another one. It says, there are many children in Gaza who have no family left. Who is taking care of them?
Yeah, that's a tragedy. I think one of the goals for the genocide is to destroy the social fabric and social cohesion of the communities in Gaza. But it is still a strength for that community. So they've been taken into other families to take care of them, the distant relatives, people who are able to get these kids to take care of them. There was a story that was run, I think, a few weeks ago. There was like a bombing on a Norway school, and bodies everywhere, blood everywhere. And this man found a baby crying, took the baby, washed the baby, and then migrated to Rafah. And then when the borders were open, went back to northern Gaza. And he was interviewed on the TV and said, I have this baby who calls me dad now. I don't know whose baby this is, but I've been taking care. Like, essentially, he was made a single father, out of nowhere. And then the real father saw the video, and then he said, "Oh, that's my baby." So he found the man, and he got his baby back. Right. So, I mean, Palestinians will take care of Palestinians. We'll take care of each other. We'll love each other. We'll love the babies. We love kids. Gaza is predominantly children, right? We celebrate childhood. And, I think one of the ailments of this genocide is that it alienates you from your own humanity sometimes, to have to come to terms with the fact that a human being can shoot a baby on the head. Like, how much dehumanization, how much moral degradation you have to go through as a person to allow yourself to kill a baby like that. And then you have to sit there and accept that this is possible for human beings to experience. I'm talking about the Israeli soldiers here, right? So it's pretty horrific to have to go through this thought and emotional experience. But that's how these kids are being taken care of.
Thank you. All right. So I think we have time for one more online question, then we'll do the in-person questions. So, and I'm going to challenge y'all to answer this question in about 3 minutes, if you can. So it says, how are joint efforts like Project Rosanna helping Palestinians? Do y'all know this? Project Rosanna? No? Okay, then I'll do the other one. How can healthcare leadership in the U.S. be encouraged to acknowledge and address the realities of the situation in Palestine? If you can do that in 3 minutes, we'd really appreciate it.
So, like Dr. Karama said about MGH, the same applies for many other US organizations. An uphill battle. You know, I used to be a member of the American Psychiatric Association, and the conversation that were had on different caucuses, on different groups, is just mind-blowing. That these are psychiatrists who take care of people's feelings. Like we had one American Israeli psychiatrist who was advocating that a Shifa hospital had the Hamas headquarters. It's just like Israeli talking points. And this is not just in psychiatry. The American Medical Association did not take a brave stance against the genocide in Gaza, for example. Right. I used to be a long-term student of and a trainee and a fellow and a graduate of the Boston Psychoanalytic Society Institute. Used to be on Beacon here. They've been vocal about, you know, the current administration and the discrepancies in health and psychological well-being. Did not say a word about Gaza. So I think the work that Karama is doing and Doctors Against Genocide is phenomenal. So I think we have to join forces and be more vocal. That's how we should do it.
Yeah, I don't have much to add. I mean, I think local acts of courage, building, a movement, it's the only way to do it. I mean, I think the example of, right, the board member and Lockheed Martin says it all, right, in terms of what we're actually up against, right? But also then, there's no other way, right? Those are the power structures that are in place. Those are the people who are, in many ways controlling decision-making at these institutions. And that's probably not, unfortunately, super unique to the Mass General Brigham system. But it means that, we have a lot of power, certainly for folks who are working within healthcare institutions in terms of, even consideration of things of like how we could even withhold our labor and things like that we haven't, really tapped into. But I think if we were really organized, right, you could stop the system, right, in ways that would force a conversation. And so, I think those are things to aspire to.
All right, thank you so much. Annie's going to take on the next portion.
Yes, I'm Annie, and so here are some questions from the whole group of you. How frequent are the incidents of children being brought into hospitals with bullets through their heads or chests?
Maybe also, yes.
At the beginning, there was very intense attacks, and there was a child being killed every 10 minutes. That was the statistic. And that continued until the ceasefire. And then after the ceasefire, we are left with all the repercussions from the genocide. No medications, no anesthesia, malnutrition, children frozen to death. Every other day, there are 6 babies who die because of low temperature. So we will continue to see a very high mortality and very high morbidity coming from the genocide. And the only way to do it is to actually not just enforce the ceasefire, but to allow unlimited humanitarian and medical aid to Gaza. And that's what we need to keep pushing for. I think donations are great, but there has to be a systematic change. And systematic change can only happen with pressure on policymakers and massive, massive pressure. And I think we are at a point where we should look for our allies in other struggles and continue to work together to really make a different reality for all of us. And without that, we will continue to see children being killed. If not in Gaza, Lebanon was next, and who knows and Syria was. I'm happy that Syria is actually got rid of its dictator, but still, the Israelis are infringing on Syria.
Can we hear more about how, yeah, yes. Can we hear more about how American medical and mental health associations have reacted to the genocide? Has there, is there any success in getting through to them, or has there been?
So I follow this very closely because we have multiple petitions to American Medical Association, American Academy of Pediatrics, American Academy of Neurology, and Psychiatry. And we have seen the American Academy of Pediatrics president, she wrote a letter to Anthony Blinken asking for the whereabouts of Dr. Hussam Abu Safiya and asking that Anthony Blinken gives a record of what is happening to the healthcare system in Gaza, which is a step in the right direction. She did not call it a genocide. She did not condemn. All she did was an inquiry. Unfortunately, within the American Academy of Pediatrics, there was a massive pushback against her. And there has been an internal memorandum prohibiting members of saying anything about Palestine and anything about Gaza and anything on the listservs within the American Academy of Pediatrics that is related to Gaza has been prohibited. And this is to say that these associations and institutions probably are a lost cause by now, and we really need a new, we need to create our own. And I think, you know,
No.
and I think we are seeing grassroots movements to build a different medical reality that is anti-genocide, that is rooted in justice, and that is very much grassroots. And I think, you know, all of us here will make it happen.
Thank you.
So from the psychiatry standpoint, from mental health, so I'm no longer a member of the American Psychiatric Association because they don't listen. When we tried hard, they're not listening. So I decided not to be a member anymore. The American Academy of Child Psychiatry issued a statement about October 7th. And then when many people emailed them back saying, why are you not talking about Gaza, right? They reintroduced another statement saying that we denounce killing of children and we feel for the kids, the children of Gaza. So you talk about Gaza. But there's mounting pressure on physicians and organizations. Now there is an organization in the US, I think it's called Jewish American Physicians, I think, for Israel or something. But this is an organization that is newly invented. And the goal is to follow all the other medical associations to make sure that they're all singing, you know, along the same lines of the pro-Israeli propaganda. I was a panelist in the last ACAP meeting in Seattle, where we had a panel about Gaza. The almighty president of the Israeli Psychiatric Society sent a letter himself asking them to unseat me from the panel. Wow. And there was like a campaign calling me a raging anti-Semite. And if you know me, you know nothing is raging about me. You know? Right. But anyways, so but the ACAP, to their credit, they didn't listen to that. So I was able to speak on the panel, and we had great reviews, and it was great civil conversations. There was no interruption. It was a fully packed room, and it was great. So it was a panel on Gaza, about the children of Gaza.
Child psychiatry.
Child psychiatry, you know. So basically there will be continuous pressures, and you will have to figure out, is this organization something I can live with and stay within and work within the organization, or I just have to kind of pick up and go because they're not listening, or because they're, quite frankly, very Zionist or like pro-Israel. So you gotta pick your battles.
Yeah, I can just say about the American Medical Association as well. There was a lot of reports early on that they were shutting down conversation, and then actually, while there was almost nothing in any of the major medical journals, American medical journals, they commissioned a piece from bioethicist named Matthew Wynia that, among other things, argued, and this was back, I think, in like November of 2023, that argued that reasonable people could come to different conclusions about the ethics of bombing children if militants were thought or known to be nearby. And so it just gives you, I think, an indication of, yeah, how I guess the most powerful medical association in the country is positioned here. And I mean, I'm sure there are many more examples and to give, but I think it gives some. And then, you know, with regard to academic medical centers, institutions have had multiple talks and panels canceled. One, UCSF, University of Texas in Houston was canceled last minute. There's another one in Dallas that went all the way up to the president of the university, and they actually tried to cancel it, but their lawyers told them it would actually be an infringement on academic freedom. And so, you know, this kind of thing is like essentially the norm within, you know, again, these associations, but also the academy.
But then we have this, and we have, you know, this is a very high level academic medical talk, and with very good audience and audience online. And I think we have to create our own spaces where we can educate ourselves and others, and, you know, they will become the obsolete, these you know, the official institutions are not doing their jobs. So we are not going to just wait for them to do their job. We will just do their job for them.
Right. The next one is complicity. Every lawyer who remains silent as international law is undermined is complicit. Every doctor who remains silent as the Hippocratic Oath is violated is complicit. How to expose this hypocrisy?
I think, you know, with the Genocide Convention, there is a duty to report and duty to prevent, and this is on every government that signed up to the Genocide Convention. We, as a medical community, have failed miserably in holding our oath and, you know, speak up against genocide. And one thing that we are trying to do is to introduce the medical definition of genocide, which is focused on prevention and detection. Just like we look at cancer or diabetes, chronic diseases, we have to identify the signs and the symptoms of the condition in order and diagnose it correctly to be able to treat it. So the medical definition of genocide is looking at the signs and symptoms in any community that can lead to genocide, like dehumanization, racism, segregation, ghettoization, and make it a medical duty to detect these and document them and come up with a diagnosis or a warning. For example, you know, impression pending genocide, or impression very high risk of genocide, and make it a medical calling for all of us to speak up against it. This sounds like theory, but we are introducing this to the United Nations Right to Health Special Rapporteur and the Special Rapporteur to Human Rights as well. And medical role for the health community to speak up against genocide. So we are not just waiting for AMA to wake up, or, you know, American Academy of Pediatrics to grow a spine. We want them to actually be demanded by their profession to speak up, just like we identify child abuse as a medical condition and we have an obligation to report it, or sexual abuse or bullying or human trafficking, all these are medical emergencies that we have to report as doctors or nurses. Genocide has to be at the same category.
Yeah, and I think what we've learned from the last year and a half, right, regarding complicity of institutions, organizations, right, I think the question mentioned doctors and lawyers, is that right? People are not shameable actually in these positions, right? The universities, right, say like Columbia University, they'd rather call in the police to beat their own students than to even have conversations about boycott, for example, right? So that's not a shameable, right? They've sort of proven this. But what that does, right, as Karam was saying, right, it creates the space to really grow a movement, because really the mask is off, to really expose, being like, these are these institutions claim to stand up for these values, right? Columbia will like brag about, its revolutionary students of the late 60s. We know that's now, it couldn't be more obvious that that's BS, right? So that's an opportunity to bring more people into a movement, right, to, a completely alternative nexus of power that is disconnected from those platforms of mainstream power to then do something differently. So I think that's been my big takeaway from the last year and a half, right, is that we'll be, it's not to say it's a waste of time. It's just that with the current power structures, what they are, and the urgency of this situation, right, there's no one listening.
Next is white sulfur usage, long-term goals of Palestine, attacks, WB attacks similar to Gaza. How can we stop us from being a partner in this genocide? WB is.
Or West Bank.
West Bank.
attacks.
Oh, and then how can settler colonialism be stopped in Palestine, USA, and the other sites?
Yeah, I mean, I think with like white sulfur and all this, right, things have been, everything's been documented, right, including white sulfur. People like Hassan Abu Sitta, who's referenced before, also in southern Lebanon. This isn't certainly not the first time either that it's been used. And so, part of what obviously has happened is and someone mentioned before about all of the single bullets to the head and chest, right, that were documented. I mean, dozens of cases were documented, right? Even the New York Times published it. But this isn't new, right? During the Great March of Return, right, protests from 2018, there was not even just all these examples of snipers killing medics, killing disabled people, intentionally maiming people, etc. There were entire profiles where they interviewed them and they admitted that that's what they're doing, right? So this whole everything has kind of been documented and is in the one sense known and is out there, and all of these violations. And essentially many of what the violations do is they test out the international waters of what will be allowed in order to escalate that violation, right? So when, Thaer talked about the Shifa hospital, the initial invasions of Shifa in November 2023, right? And then there was the enormous one in April 2024. They destroyed the entire hospital. 30 to 40% of the entire healthcare capacity of the Gaza Strip was destroyed. But that initial one, there was a former State Department advisor, I think his name was like Brian, I can't remember exactly his name. He basically said that he said this in November. He said, what I think is happening here is that they're testing to see what would be allowable, right? By if they can attack Shifa, bomb, Shifa, and if nothing happens, right, this will set up a context in which they know they can bomb all the other hospitals. That's exactly what happened, right? And so, this essentially this is overarching sort of context of impunity, right? So, I mean, it's almost impossible for anyone to follow all of the war crimes and crimes against humanity that are happening, right? Many people try, but just I think to some extent, right, we can sometimes focus it on those things, and essentially they're known, right, and they're even known internally within the State Department. I mean, there were all these reports to Blinken, right, that it came out later that he obviously actively ignored. So I think, it helps. I think it just to give that context in order to again think about this strategy piece of like, how exactly are we going to, use this knowledge, right? But also understand that certain forms of documentation aren't going to be the answer, right? Because human rights organizations on the ground in Gaza and the West Bank have been documenting this for a long time, including, attacks in the West Bank, right? There were dozens of attacks in the West Bank on healthcare every month in 2022, for example, in 2021, in 2020, in 2019, 2018, every month attacks on healthcare. We wrote a piece. There was a paper in the New England Journal on attacks on healthcare in Syria, I think around 2015. We tried to write a similar one on Palestine. Be like, oh, you guys published this piece on Syria. Would you, and this was well before October 7th. This was like 2020. And of course they rejected it. We ended up publishing in some European journal. But, dozens. So like all of this on the one hand is known. And so we have to think about, just continue to be strategic about how what are the levers in which we can ultimately act on that. So that's just some thoughts about some of the details. I know there were many other questions embedded, but
Anyone else? Okay. Has Israel deliberately not included health care workers in the prisoner releases?
I mean, I know there are still something like 130 from Gaza that are being held, and Hussam, who was there discussed, is still being held. He was expected to be released in the 6th exchange, but was not. So I think there have been some who have been released, right, including Ahmad Thaer, and there was also the director of Shifa Hospital, who was held for about 9 months and tortured. But that he was released even earlier as part of it. So I don't know if there's a systemic pattern. What we do know, right, is statistically from the data that healthcare workers have been killed at a higher proportion of compared to the general population. Like something like 3% of all Palestinians in Gaza have been killed, and healthcare workers at an even higher, right? So certainly they've been a huge number of people who have been rounded up, taken to these torture chambers, tortured. Sexually assaulted in some cases to death, including Adnan Al-Bursh, the director of orthopedics, as well.
Okay. All right. And this is directed to Dr. Mohammad. You discussed the importance of addressing malnutrition for the children and the poor mental health of the children at baseline. Now much worse after the latest war. How do you see the way forward to start the healing? Does the healing focus on food and shelter, or is it addressing the effects of trauma on the children urgently? What mental health resources are needed?
Yeah, the answer is if you've played with children, right? The child will not play well or play freely if they're hungry, right? So we need all of the above. You have to feed the children, play with the children, and there are on the ground right now a lot of supports for children to play and sing and dance. And the question is how do you protect that? So this is where the political interventions and solutions have to be implemented to push for a longer ceasefire so the kids can play. And the malnutrition now, as the trucks come in more, I think they're helping a little bit. But like I said, even before the genocide, food was not really great in Gaza, and children already had malnutrition. I think studies show before the genocide that about 20% of kids have anemia because of the low iron that they can't access from their diet in Gaza. So the answer is all of the above, and we hope that the ceasefire still holds so the kids can grow and play. And then what you can do is, like I said, if you want to engage in a community event, maybe start a local food pantry for Gaza, maybe in your community, and see the pouring of love, and people will come in, and then you'll see how many people care and how much people know about Gaza.
there is also, you know, the need for being heard and being seen for the people in Gaza. And one thing that we are trying to work is to actually do twin agreements between medical doctors here and medical doctors in Gaza. So, for example, you know, I'm a neurologist. I will connect with a neurologist there, and that will be my peer. Or, you know, even a nurse or even a child, like, you know, having pen pals or having children from here connect with children there, it will make, you know, will create a strong network and strong support that helps us heal from being sick from the genocide, as being, you know, actively involved in the lives and the support of the people there, and also helps them be seen and be heard and have their voices listened to by the whole world. I think there is a huge need for people to tell their stories. And, you know, we can see a lot of the medical students and a lot of the people in Gaza have accounts, and they tell their stories, and they are compelling stories, and it is healing to be heard. So, you know, any way to connect with the people there will humanize them and will also empower them.
And we're just so thankful to Dr. Mohammad, Dr. Wispelwey, Dr. Umer, and Dr. Ahmad. So we're so thankful. Thank you so much. All right. We'll finish up with some action steps that we actually can take. We have signups for medical missions that will take place in 2025. Nancy Mansour from Eyewitness Palestine was going to be here to speak for 10 minutes, but she fell sick today. So in spite of that, we will have the sign up, and you'll be able to contact her. Dr. Wispelwey also will be doing sign-ups, and you can speak to him directly in regards to sign-ups in the West Bank. We do have some petitions to sign up there. Our organizations are here for sign-up as well. And please feel free to all of our in-house audience to catch our speakers. And if you didn't get your question answered, please see them. They've graciously agreed to stay a little bit longer. And I think that's it.
Thank you, Margaret.
Okay, you're very welcome.
Hi, I just want to add a few last things in the action steps, some organizations to support. So with regard to the need for medical, humanitarian, political, and legal action to help stop this genocide. So DAWN is a nonprofit organization that seeks to reform U.S. policy in the Middle East. They just submitted a case to the International Criminal Court, 172 pages of communication, to investigate Biden, Blinken, and Austin for aiding and abetting Israeli crimes in Gaza. So this is dawnmina.org. There's Taxpayers Against Genocide, which is seeking to a federal class action lawsuits. Okay, these are ongoing against the Congress people who voted to support genocide, and they're also going into the international arena. UNRWA, please support UNRWA. Donate to unrwausa.org. This not only helps support humanitarian aid to Gaza, they provide about 60% of all humanitarian aid, but they also support the right of return, which is why Israel hates it so much. And they're still working there despite the illegal Knesset ban. Finally, I want to talk about a new policy, which is a nonpartisan political action committee founded in October by the Biden administration resignees Josh Paul and Tariq Habash. Its goal is to reshape U.S. policies towards Israel and Palestine to bring them in line with America's actual interests. There's a major political problem, and we all need to bring more Americans into the movement and rebalance the incentives for the elected officials for the two things they care most about, which is votes and money. So right now, the top priority is preserving the space for free speech and debate here in the U.S. In three ways: by pushing back on malign bills and orders that attempt to section off the issue of Palestine and shut down any criticism of current U.S. policy by making the topic more accessible to more Americans, and by building broader coalitions to center Palestine in the civil rights, civil liberties, and foreign policy reform and social and economic justice movements. So we have pamphlets out there for a new policy. A newpolicy.org. And we have the pamphlets out front. So get the word out, sign up to them. And if you're going to Washington or talking with your federal elected representatives, touch base with the New Policy PAC to strategize for best approaches and opportunities. And also donate. Even a small monthly gift can help them build for the long road ahead, understanding the urgency now. Last thing, I'd like SEIU to come up. Sorry, I know.
One quick announcement before we go on. On behalf of Community Church, there will be a celebration of the life of Joan Livingston in this space here tonight at 6 p.m. She was a longtime peace activist and Palestine solidarity activist who passed recently. Who's next?
Hi, thank you all. My name's Anissa Hashmi. I'm a psychiatry resident at Boston Medical Center. I have so many great role models here. Thank you for your work. So I'm here representing the Committee of Interns and Residents, which is part of the labor service union for all healthcare workers. And we did some pretty cool things over the past year, specifically that we were one of the first union locals to pass resolutions endorsing the boycott, divest, sanction movement and unendorsing politicians who support occupation, genocide, and apartheid. So this vote, thank you. This vote was passed with overwhelming margins, and we represent 260, or maybe over 260 unionized physicians across the nation. And it's actually grown because we just got MGB. And yeah, it's very exciting. We were able to pass this in May of 2024. Since then, it took us a very long time to pass these resolutions, months and months of one-on-one speaking with our union members and also representing the resolutions at convention. We all helped co-author these resolutions. And we were following the demands of the Palestinian General Federation of Trade Unions, as well as the Labor for Palestine National Network, which is here in the United States. And then in this December of 2024, in Alameda County, they did a divestment vote of $32 million from Caterpillar Inc. This is the world's largest manufacturer of construction equipment, which has faced criticism for its role in the destruction of Palestinian homes, infrastructure, and agriculture, as well as the U.S. prison industrial complex, border militarization, and immigration detention centers. So they were able to pass this divestment process with the support of Bay Area Divest and endorsements from our labor union. So some of our labor union members were able to offer testimonies working off the resolutions that we passed. We're hoping to do this kind of work here in Boston as well. So would love to work with you all.
Hi, I just wanted to add one thing. Margaret already mentioned the list of healthcare delegations. There's also a list of organizations doing solidarity and cultural tours of Palestine. And for anyone who hasn't gone, I really recommend it. They're on the back table. We're running low. It's better probably to get an email PDF anyway for the links. So please, if you want one, write down your email address and I can email you the PDFs directly. A pink index card.
Thank you all. Thank you to the speakers.
There will be 2 more events. One will be in Springfield, one will be in Providence, Rhode Island. How do we